Howdy there, and welcome back to the Who Will Win podcast for the first ever episode. This episode is going to be based on Daniel Ricciardo. Yes, he did leave a few months ago back at the Singapore Grand Prix, but for context, I grew up in a family, or I'm still growing up, in a family that never was interested in motorsport. To be honest, it's not too massive in Ireland once you get into it and you start meeting people that love it. The community is quite big for such a small country, but I never knew of anyone that watched F1. I didn't even know F1 existed until Drive to Survive. And to be honest, Daniel Ricciardo is the person that got me involved. He's the one that put me on this path that I'm on now. I started karting just because of how much I loved racing, and that love for racing stemmed from watching Drive to Survive. And obviously in 2019 there was only one season, season 1 of Drive to Survive, and the main character or person in it was Daniel Ricciardo. So he's kind of shaped my view of Formula 1, and from there my passion for the sport, and I guess my love for the character that he was, grew from there. Even though he was my favourite driver, I'll try to be as unbiased looking back at his career as I can. As I previously said, Daniel lost his seat back in Singapore in 2024, and I thought the circumstances were quite unfair. I understand that they wanted to get Liam in the car. They wanted to see what their options were, especially since they weren't super happy with Sergio, even though from the outside they kept saying that everything was fine. Even on the weekend they were saying Daniel wouldn't get dropped, but he's given so much to the sport and to Red Bull. I thought they could have given him until the end of the year, and to be honest, at the start of the year he was underperforming slightly, but then again the car was not quite up to scratch on his side. Again, not trying to over defend him, but you know, he did say that he thought there was something wrong with the car and he wanted to change chassis, and then when they went to China and they changed the chassis, he was automatically more comfortable. Now obviously that doesn't mean that there was a problem with the car and he could have just been more comfortable that weekend, but it's highly coincidental that the second the team changed the chassis for him, he suddenly feels more comfortable. And unfortunately for him, Lance crashing into the back of him, and a few more issues the following races when the car was still arguably competitive. He couldn't get the results that the speed of the car merited and that his performance merited. But as the year went on, the ORB, or Racing Bulls, their car didn't really stand up to the development of the rest of the teams, and they just stepped a little bit back. They couldn't compete relatively anymore. Into the start of the year they were hoping for podiums, and now they're struggling for points finishes by the halfway point of the season. And it was just really unfortunate, I think, because the points gap don't show the whole story. They do show a partial one, because as I said, the start of the year Yuki was performing slightly better and the car was slightly more competitive, but then as Daniel got better and better, the car wasn't really there competitively, and just really unfortunate, I believe, circumstances. And I can see quite a different scenario playing out, because Sergio wasn't performing. He hasn't really performed superbly well over the last 2 years, I'd say. Started off well in 2023, but then in 2024 faded away, just as it did the previous 3 years, 2022, 2023 and 2024 actually. Towards the last 2/3 of the season, 3/4 of the season, he just couldn't stick with Max, and he wasn't comfortable in the car, making mistakes, just underperforming relatively to what he had in the past. Like in 2020, he had a pretty incredible year. He was performing so well, and it was, I think, a shame to see what happened. But I also believe it was an opportunity for Red Bull to put Daniel back in the Red Bull, like he was between 2014 and 2018. I think he would have done a pretty good job. He's the only driver that's kind of squared up well against Max, if that makes sense. Apart from Carlos back in Toro Rosso, but I don't really think they were putting Carlos in the car, were they? But if they put Daniel back in, I'd say mid-season, then they could have put Liam in the ORB, and I don't see how it would have changed much. I think if they left Daniel leave in a Red Bull in Abu Dhabi, it would have been so much better, not just for the sport, and obviously personally I would have loved to see it, but for sponsors and everything. I know Sergio has a massive train, I guess, of sponsors that follow him, all the Mexican fans, the incredible Mexican fans that follow him, and that is a huge asset to Red Bull as a company, sponsorship wise and selling merchandise and clothing. But that's aside from the point. I think performance wise, I don't think they're ever going to put Yuki in, so they should have put Daniel in, and then, as I said, they could have measured up Liam, and if they're not happy with Liam's performance, then they could put Yuki in. If Daniel wasn't performing, if Daniel was doing well, keep him, and then if Yuki wasn't doing such a great job like he was, then you could have gotten rid of him if he was doing poorly and still brought up Isaac. Or if Liam and Yuki weren't doing well, then you could have had Isaac and Franco. So there's so many possibilities that could have happened. I think it's kind of a shame that they didn't. Now on to why Daniel left Red Bull in the first place back in 2018. Max was pretty young back then, as he still is now, I guess, and he was doing an immense job. But I guess Daniel wasn't happy with the situation. I mean, he's been pretty open about that. He felt like they were favouring him, and yeah, he thought he deserved more. There was obviously discussions of the late Dietrich, founder of Red Bull, having conversations with him, trying to match Max's salary, and Daniel supposedly not thinking it was enough. And I can understand why. He was in the team through the tough days. They were winning in 2010 to 2013 with Sebastian, and then in 2014 they're not fighting for championships anymore, and Daniel put in so much hard work. He was winning races for them when even Sebastian couldn't, and he was doing such a great job through those years. Like certain publications like The Race even said 2014, 2016 arguably he was the best driver on the grid, and I don't really disagree with that. The Mercedes were so far ahead that he couldn't do much. He could get the odd win, and that was about it. But he did manage to finish third in both seasons, and I feel like he didn't think Red Bull were rewarding him for all his hard work, and he was unsure of Honda because their tough stint with McLaren, and I can understand why he left. In hindsight, it's obviously easy to say that he shouldn't have left, but it's so difficult in the moment, and I do think if he had his time back he'd still make the same choice, which I know is easy for me to say, but I do genuinely think he would have stuck with his decision of moving to Renault. And even the decision to move to Renault wasn't too bad. He was doing pretty well, especially well in the latter half of 2019, and he beat Nico. And then back in 2020, I know it was a odd season with COVID, and he was fighting Esteban, who was out for a year, but he did a fantastic job. He was getting podiums left, right, centre, like at Imola and the Nürburgring. He was doing a really, really good job, and he got a lot of fourth places as well. And in a Renault that probably wasn't as consistent as the McLaren and the Racing Point back were in 2020, he was still doing such an incredible job, and I do feel that he would have stuck by that. Also, then his move to McLaren, I do think it was a sensible one. McLaren were on the up. He was unsure of Renault, just as he was with the Honda engine. And I can see again where he was coming from. It was unfortunate in 2021 that his driving style didn't suit the McLaren, and there's not much he can do about that. He tried adapting, but tricky for him to drive. His driving style is quite, not peculiar, but I don't see a lot of it, where he likes to brake a bit early and kind of carry the speed through the corner, whereas the McLaren, you had to be quite aggressive. From what I've seen, you got to brake really late and then try and get the car rotated, and he struggled with that because back in Red Bull he was used to it. He was driving like that for so many years, and then to change teams, even Renault, his driving style suited the car, and then to go into 2021 and feel out of sorts, it must have been tough. And then in 2022, just the whole new regulations of cars doesn't really look like it suited him well. But then again, you look at his performance back in Miami, and he did such a great job in the sprint and spring qualifying. You know, he got 4th and then managed to keep, I think it was the Ferrari of Carlos behind him, and it was a really, really good drive. And Yuki went on to have a really good drive in the main race. But I think it proves the point that if the car suited him a bit more, he would have been able to get more out of it. And I do think McLaren, even though he wasn't performing, that's the be all and end all, I guess, but his style didn't suit it, and therefore he couldn't get the best out of himself, and then that would just make him lose confidence, I'd imagine. And, you know, being a top sports person, confidence is key. Even though Daniel was, and still is, my favourite driver, I've nothing against Yuki or Sergio or Liam. I actually quite like all three of them, to be honest. It's unfortunate Yuki didn't have a go at the seat. I think he's proven he deserved a chance, just as like a lot of people are saying. But then I quite like Liam. He's quite, not relaxed, but quietly confident. He seems like a really hard worker, and I think that's what Red Bull need. They need someone not to get scared by Max or frustrated on track, that they'll just come back, look at the data, they'll try and figure it out, get as close as they can, and they know that Max is the best driver in Formula 1 right now, and if they're a tenth or two off, it's not the end of the world. It's a car that's designed for him, which is fair enough. And if you're driving in what could almost be described as someone else's car, you know, living in someone else's house almost, if he's only 1 or 2 tenths off, you know, that's a really solid job, and I think he'd be happy with that. Obviously he'll want to beat him at some stage, but I don't even know if Max is going to stay around at Red Bull for that long. And Sergio losing his seat, it is tough for him. He is a really good driver, and it's kind of sad to see him lose his way. A small bit like Daniel, maybe not to the same extent. Sergio a bit more extreme in his drop off, because he'd start the season off strong, and then, as I said before, in the latter stages of the year, he'd be struggling so much, he might not even be scoring points at the majority of races, and that must have been really tough for him to get through. And I am actually happy to see him out of F1, not out of F1, but have a break if he wants to, because, you know, he's got a young family and it'd be great for him to spend time, but he's a competitor, he'll want to be back in the car, and I'm sure opportunities might arise as a reserve with a team, maybe even Aston Martin with his past there as Racing Point and Force India, or maybe Cadillac. I think there's a lot of opportunities. I think he'd be great Le Mans driver, a WEC driver, endurance driver. I think he'd be phenomenal at getting through the stints. You know, he's known in F1 for his incredible tyre management, and I think that could really benefit him in places like that. These guys are F1 drivers in the end of the day, so you can't feel too bad for them, but, you know, there's a lot of pressure on their shoulders, and some of them are quite young, So I do wish the best for Sergio and Yuki, and of course Liam, who's now stepping into that Red Bull for 2025. Now, just to conclude the podcast, this episode, first ever episode on the Who Will Win podcast, I would like to go over some of what I believe are Daniel's best races, even though I wasn't around for most of them, as I only started watching F1 in 2020. I do believe he had some absolutely stellar and World Championship worthy drives, and the first one in my mind is 2014 Canada, his very first win. Tough conditions, a lot of incidents. He won the race under safety car, I believe, with a crash between Sergio and Felipe, I think, at turn 1, both going around Sebastian, and the Mercedes having quite a bit of trouble that race, leaving the door open for him to take his first win. And he actually did quite a really good job that year, to be honest. He got 3 of his 8 wins that year. He won in Canada, and he won in Hungary and Belgium, I believe. And then his next win wouldn't come until 2016, which is quite a bit. I don't think anyone won a race in 2015 except for the 2 Mercedes and Sebastian. And then missing out on that win in Monaco 2016 would have been pretty brutal, I'd imagine. And it was quite nice to see him make up for it, or not make up for it, for Red Bull to make up to him, because they didn't have the tyres and it was kind of their fault he lost the race. But it was nice to see him win that and have a final good year with Red Bull, in the sense of getting a few wins. Obviously he had engine troubles with Renault and he wasn't super happy with them, but also his winning in China in 2018 was pretty cool. All his overtakes and going toe to toe with Valtteri, his overtake into turn 5 or 6, I think, at the Shanghai International Circuit was really cool. You should check that on YouTube if you have time. He drove an absolutely incredible race that weekend, and I think if things had gone slightly differently for him, he could have easily been a world champion. And in 2021 he had the only win I got to see, which was at Monza, and I thought it was really impressive. He was struggling against Lando and in the McLaren for the first bit of the year, and then they go to Monza, I believe, after the summer break, and I think he loves it there. Most drivers do. The incredible Tifosi, and I think he's actually part Italian, and so it would have been really special. He held off Lando really well, in my opinion, and Max and Lewis had their incident, but even without that happening, I do think they would have battled and cost each other time, and I do think he could have still won the race. Maybe Lando would have been a bit closer, but after the pit stops, I do think it closed the gap a little bit. So who knows what would have happened there, but I do think Daniel would have still won the race. He had a great launch off the grid, starting in second. Max was first, and he got the inside line down to turn 1, passed him in the chicane, and then he was just gone for the rest of the race. I don't actually know if anyone else led a few laps. I think they might have during the pit stop sequence, but it just shows how incredible he was on his day and how incredible he could have been over the course of a year, that even in a really tough year where he was struggling, he managed to pull out a win. And it was a really special one even for McLaren. It was their first win since the Lewis Hamilton Jenson Button days, I think, in the early 2010s, so that would have been really special for them as well. I actually remember screaming at the TV, because in 2021 I was probably, I was a good bit younger, and I was quite excited because it was only my second year of F1, and Daniel was leading the race, and I see him got a few podiums in 2020, but when Lewis and Max crashed, I was screaming at my television, because I was so excited, because it was not guaranteed, but you know, it was so much more exciting now that Daniel was one of the main people for the win, even though he was before. But the two main title contenders out leaves the door wide open, and it was absolutely fantastic to see Daniel get his sadly final win. But I know this episode was quite short, but I just did want to pay a quick homage to my hero and my favourite driver of all time, and the person that got me into this incredible world that is motorsport and Formula 1 and racing. And I do owe a lot of not my personality, but what I love to him, as he got me interested, as I said before. So just to finally say thank you for listening, and thank you to Daniel Ricciardo for being such an incredible role model. I know a lot of people around the world will feel the same way as I feel. An incredible sportsman, an incredible person, and you could be ruthless on track and still be an incredibly kind and caring person off the track. So thank you for listening to the Who Will Win podcast. It's been a pleasure. I hope you enjoyed, and once again, finally, thank you, Daniel Ricciardo, for being such an inspiring role model, and I do hope you enjoy the rest of your life. If you don't come back to racing or Formula 1, I do hope you enjoy, and yeah, I'll say it one more time. Thank you, Daniel Ricciardo, for everything.